Hi folks, welcome to episode 23 of the Epochs of the Lotus Eaters. I'm joined by Bo, and we're going to be continuing our discussions on the 100 Years' War by talking about the Battle of Poissier, which is another famous English victory, as you do. I'm sure we'll get around to a few English defeats at some point, but now isn't that time. So the Battle of Poitiers happened a decade after the Battle of Crécy. Why is that?
Well, there's lots of different reasons. When you look at the whole of the 100 Years' War, there's quite a few hiatuses. In fact, in the next episode, when we talk about Agincourt, we'll see it's a whole generation, more than a generation later. Yeah. The world has moved on. It's quite different. So I think we're used to wars where, such as, I think of the second Iraq war, where the Pentagon says there's going to be a war, and moments later, things start blowing up. Yeah. The world's so different to that, you know. You can declare war and nothing might not happen for years and years. So here, there was a bit of a hiatus. One of the main reasons, the big thing is the plague.
Yes,
that's the main thing. Yes, I think if people are sort of relatively new to history, or they're just sort of building their knowledge, a really, really important thing to keep in mind is the Black Death, sort of the world before and after. There's sort of important dates, aren't there? Depending on what nationality you are, 1066, 1588, 1399, whatever. The Black Death is one for everyone. It's interesting. It's good to have it in mind. And it's, well, for Britain, for England, it was 1348 to 49 is the Great Pestilence. That's what they called it at the time, the Great Pestilence. Quite often it's referred to in the sources. They didn't call it the Black Death. And it's one of the worst, arguably the worst outbreaks of plague there's ever been, certainly in recorded history. There's other ones, aren't there? Sort of the Plague of Justinian, and there's one in the 17th century, a big one. But this one, the Black Death of 1348-49 is sort of, well, it's world-changing. Yeah. And there's no exaggeration.
I mean, as I understand it, it basically comes from the East. And, like all over the world, just millions of people die. Something like a third of Europe's population dies from this plague. And so, like, it's bodies in the streets, people barricaded up in their homes. It is just the worst. And it has massive economic effects, upheavals. It's one of the reasons it's credited for the end of serfdom in England and things like that is suddenly, well, who's going to work the fields? It's like, well, these people whose labour is suddenly a lot more valuable than it was a year ago, and things like this. So, like, you can't really downplay the impact of the Black Death on the world.
Yeah, different historians do argue a little bit about to what extent it sort of reworked the world, reimagined the world. It's difficult to avoid the conclusion that it definitely did to a large degree, but to what degree? Because some people say, if, for example, say the Black Death hadn't happened, would there still be serfdom, feudalism of a type or not? And other people, like revisionists, if they're trying to sell a book with a new angle, saying it wasn't that important, actually. The world was already moving towards a less feudalistic style of doing things. Anyway, it seems that the numbers between a third and two-thirds, so maybe as much as a half of all people. I mean, in a world that's much less populated than we are today already. So some accounts say they thought like the world was ending, that it would kill everyone. Because in some places it hits some places worse than others. Quite often rural areas were hit even worse. So whole communities might die of it. Things like that.
Some mad reactions. What was the German flagellants and things like that, where they would march themselves just along the countryside, whipping themselves, assuming that the plague was the wrath of God and that the end times had arrived. It's like, what else are you going to do? Like,
it's
what are your options?
I was listening to a thing just the other day saying that some people became a lot more pious and God-fearing because they thought they'd annoyed God, and a lot of others became essentially atheists, abandoned God. God has abandoned us, obviously, so why should I believe in him? It affects people in all sorts of different ways, and the descriptions are particularly horrible, of course.
Was it huge pus-filled boils under the armpits and things like that, and it's just like, it was obviously a horrific way to die as well.
And of course, we now know that it's a bacteria that is sent by fleas, which ride on the back of rats. They had no real concept of that, and all they really knew was that it was indiscriminate. Yeah. It didn't care how rich or poor you were, if you were a man or a woman, old or strong. Actually, there's a little bit that in the first wave, if you were physically strong, you'd be more likely to survive. Because it wasn't a complete death sentence. You could get it and survive.
And we have accounts of people who did get it and survive, and they describe just how awful it was to have this. But again, like with any disease, your personal physical health is important. So try and keep yourself healthy. Anyway.
But yeah, no, that's why we see at Poitiers, or in the 100 Years' War after this, the numbers of people are a lot less. Just simply, there's just fewer people in the world.
Yeah.
It seems that it first came from, as far as we know, it first sort of appears in our records with the Golden Horde in the Crimea. Then it goes down through Constantinople and ends up in the Italian ports, and then in the French Riviera, and then this is in the earlier 1340s, and by the summer of 48, it's sort of in the middle of England. And it's really terrible. But one thing I would say, just before we move on from that, is obviously a sort of a thing on a biblical scale, for want of a better word, is that the sort of simplistic view is that there was this great wave of plague in 1348 to 49, and then it passed, and we're all good from then on. No, it never went away. There was another wave, a huge wave in 1361 to 62.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And then after that,
I held the simplistic view.
But then after that, there's another one in 1369, another one in 1375, just in the north, another in 79, another in 81 to 82. It goes on.
Yeah.
And so it's not really just like this one great pestilence and then it's gone. It sticks around. And historians have said that the second wave in sort of 1361 to 62, that was what really changed demographics profoundly for generations and generations to come. Because in the first wave, even though it swept off untold numbers of people, massive percentages of people, it still left quite a lot of the healthy young people who could then repopulate within one generation. They were sort of childbearing age, young, healthy people.
Yeah.
But
childbearing age being about 15 years old.
In those days,
just for anyone who doesn't know.
But then the second wave in the 60s, early 60s, swept them off.
Yeah.
And there was no one to replace them. That's when, from that point onwards, the records seem to show, this sort of very real collapse in society in all sorts of different ways, at least of all sort of demographically. It's just a horrible story, and it wasn't just over in 2 summers.
No. And this is like right in the middle of the 100 Years' War. So between this great challenge between England and France, and so I mean, this is one of the reasons that basically campaigning was delayed for such a long time, isn't it?
Yeah.
So everyone's dying.
I mean, even Edward III, one of his daughters died of it, a 15-year-old Joan, because he had like 11 or 13 kids.
Yeah.
And then in the later one, the one in the 60s, it might have been the one in the late 1360s, his wife also dies of it, Isabella of Hainault. It didn't really respect rank.
No, not at all. Not at all.
And of course, they had no concept of bacteria or anything, so they were sort of powerless against it.
To them, it very much looks like a curse from God upon mankind.
Yeah.
So, if you had no idea about disease or germs or anything, what would you think? It's perfectly rational to be like, right, okay, well, that's the end of the world then.
And in the scriptures, there are plagues, aren't there? God does send plagues to punish men. You would think,
Yeah. It's actually, from their perspective, quite a rational assumption.
Right, yeah, from their perspective, sure. Yeah. Sure. Jumping back into the events
after that terrible bit, let's get back to the jolly bit of men killing each other.
But yeah, of course, it did ravish France as well. So it wasn't just England; it's the whole known world, really,
and even the unknown world. Like it was just everywhere. But anyway. Moving on from such dire portents.
So the great chevauchées through northern France in the 30s, in the 1330s, as great as they were, and as sort of decisive and monumental as Crécy was, it didn't spell the end of the French monarchy or anything like that. Nothing's over. No. And so, in those years, there's still a lot more. There's a lot going on, all sorts going on. I mean, the south coast of Britain gets raided by a relatively small scale. If you were there, you might not think it was small scale, but relatively small scale French raids, sort of Plymouth and Portsmouth and other places, Winchelsea I think is one, were raided by the French. And this is one of the times when the monarchy, the crown, decided to sort of start levying more taxes for defence, which never stopped. No. I mean, it dates back to hundreds and hundreds of years before, to the days of Alfred, but it's here where it sort of gets upped and formalised and all that sort of thing. So, yeah, where we said in the previous epochs that there were no great chevauchés, French chevauchés through southern England, they did do raids, though. There were raids. There was a fair amount of naval activity. One historian I was reading said that the Channel became like a cauldron of naval war, sort of on and off, but constantly.
Yeah.
Throughout the 30s and 40s.
And that was only until basically the English destroyed the French navy at the Battle of Sluis.
That's it? Yeah.
Yeah, because I read about that probably about 6 months ago, and I just find it fascinating because, like, they just seem to have this incredibly ballsy tactic of, we're just going to get on their ships and kill them. And this is not like the first time like the English fleet has used these tactics, like, or the last. And so there's this, like, we'll probably have to do an episode on it, where it's really weird, like at the Battle of Gibraltar, where the Spanish send a big armada across to go and take Gibraltar, and the English just sail out on small boats and just climb into their ships and kill them. And it's like, what a ballsy activity! This is you insane. But that's basically what happens at Sluis, isn't it?
Yeah. That's a really decisive thing as well. Really important, much more important than I think gets credit for.
Yeah.
I think unless you listen to a dedicated lecture or read a whole book about the 100 Years' War, you easily never have heard of that.
No.
And yet it's really, really quite important, I think.
It's a huge event.
If that had gone the other way, they may well have be sort of ravishing our lands, the south coast or whatever.
Well, I mean, all of the English continental possessions have been completely vulnerable, because how would we get men across reliably? We wouldn't be able to, because we held Aquitaine and, like Bordeaux and things like that at this time. So, like, how would we send men around to reinforce that? Because obviously that was just sailed around the coast of France and then dropped off. But if the French control the Channel, we can't do that. And so, all of the English possessions in France are essentially vulnerable.
Yeah, and they're already vulnerable. I mean, that's one of the things when historians can look back at this whole period and with perfect hindsight see exactly what's going on and why, or nearly. It's sort of an obvious thing to say that the entire English strategy, or all the English hopes in France, are kind of doomed, because they'll always be in France.
Yeah, there's always going to be a giant gulf of water between them.
Like, whenever you leave, like the Americans in Afghanistan, they've got all the time in the world. As soon as you leave, well, and you're going to have to leave at some point, then we'll just take it back, no problem. Yeah. We've got all the time in the world.
Literally, this war's going to go on for 100 years until you give it up.
And so the position is, we'll put up maps so it's made clear, but I mean, the Crown at that point, after the Cressy campaigns, controls Calais, controls a lot of sort of the Norman coast, and Brittany is being fought over. John of Gaunt goes over there at one point, and the English crown still holds Gascony, which is much more in the south of France. And Gascony sort of is next door to, butts to the lands of the Aquitaine. And they are really what Edward III and the English crown covet the most, because they're so rich, those lands. And they do have some sort of legitimate, albeit by now quite old, claim on them. Yeah. And so what Edward III decides to do...
Which English king was married to Eleanor of Aquitaine again?
Henry II.
Right. Because this isn't that Richard the Lionheart's mother?
Yeah, that's right.
It is, yeah. And so and that's what, 150 years or so before now.
Yeah,
so,
more.
Yeah, so it's it is.
That,
but as you say, it's an old claim.
Yeah,
but as you say, they're very nice lands, and always have been actually. But anyway,
there's the great film Lion in Winter.
I haven't seen it.
It's brilliant. You love it, Carl.
Right, okay.
Really, it's superb. Yeah. Which is all about Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Right, okay.
And it's got Anthony Hopkins as the Coeur de Lion.
Oh, really?
And
okay.
Who's it who played Peter O'Toole as Henry II?
Right.
It's excellent.
Right,
I think it was
sounds good, actually.
nominated or won some Oscars. Its choice. I recommend it to anyone who's interested in that period. But yeah, so the Aquitaine has fallen many generations ago, but Henry III still covets it. And so what he decides to do is, just to change things up a bit, is instead of just keep invading across the Channel into northern France, is to send his adult son, Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince,
Yeah.
to go down to Gascony, start doing chevauchés through southern and central France, just to cause a headache, really, for the King of France. And we've got a new king now. In the last episode, it was Philip VI. He has now died.
He died in, what, 1350, I think it was, about then?
About then, yeah, roughly then.
Yeah.
And it passes to his son, John.
Yeah.
John II, or Jean. They French call him Jean, but we'll call him John.
We'll call him John because we're English barbarians.
And so John II is, although he's sort of gone down in history, I suppose, for getting himself captured, he's
Spoilers.
actually a bit of a spoiler alert, but everyone...
Spoilers for something that happened 800 years ago.
Yeah. Before that, he's perfectly brave and competent, it seems. He's no slouch.
Nope, he's not a coward. He seems to be perfectly chivalrous. And his problem that he was facing Edward and Edward's son, who were brilliant military commanders. There's no getting around it, you know. So it's like, well, bad luck, you know. Unfortunately, you get to meet men of genius. That's not fun, you know. Yeah,
it's funny that you get certain guys that if there wasn't that one genius in their generation, they would have been the famous name that went down in all history. But there's this one guy who's better than you, and so you get put in shade forever.
I always feel that about Pompey and Caesar. Right. You know, Pompey was a perfectly good commander. There's absolutely nothing wrong with his military prowess. And yet Caesar just happens to have been better, you know, and more driven because of his debts. But anyway.
It must be annoying. It must be like being one of like the greatest sprinters in the world, but Usain Bolt exists. So it's like, oh, okay. And no one's going to remember me. So, I mean, maybe just one quote there, the top one from Nicholas Vincent, just a slight overview, just to remind people about sort of Edward III's thinking or his mindset.
Right, okay, well, to distance himself from the catastrophes of his father's reign, to divert the violent impulses of the aristocracy into foreign rather than domestic strife, to satisfy his love of chivalry and daring deeds, to associate himself with the glories of his family's past, Henry II, Richard I, Edward III embarked on a series of military campaigns that involved English armies in warfare in Scotland, France, the Low Countries, Spain, and at sea from the Firth of Forth to the Bay of Biscay. Busy.
So that I said before that Edward III's reign is a long one. It's very long, a bit too long. People say it would have been better if he'd died a little younger and let the Black Prince have a go. But he lives for a long time. It's a long reign, and a lot goes on. A lot goes on. So it's one of those reigns where if you might read a book about it or listen to a lecture, and someone will mention a whole new theatre of war you've never heard of before. It's like, that was going on as well. Oh, okay.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.